Hey everybody, this is the Brülosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and we have made it to our 430th episode, which means it's time for another Brü A. For this one, I'll be going it alone, no co-host, just me, a microphone, and my potentially awful responses to a handful of questions, all of which were submitted by patrons of Brülosophy. This is something we've been doing over the last year or so, prioritizing questions from the people who appreciate us enough to throw us some monetary love over at Patreon, which is the only reason we're still able to do this thing today. Seriously, if you like our content, you have our patrons to thank for it. And for the two of you out there who may, be wondering what the hell Patreon even is, well, it's a pretty cool platform that allows real people like you to support us financially while also getting a reward in return. What kind of rewards, you ask? Well, for $3 per month, you get access to an archive of private recipes, as well as an invitation to a monthly live brew day with a Brülosophy contributor. An additional $2 on top of that will also land you a unique discount at Yakima Valley Hops that is consistently worth more than the $5 pledge. $10 per month lands you an invitation to a monthly live video hangout with the Brülosophy crew, and $15 per month gets you a private one-on-one consultation about anything involving brewing or really anything else in life, if that's what you're looking for. And starting about a year ago, we've been tapping our patrons for these types of episodes as well, from focusing entirely on questions that they ask for Brü A to integrating their opinions in our Brews Views episodes, which has been really fun. Most importantly, though, by supporting us on Patreon, you ensure that we're able to keep producing the content that we do over on the website, as well as here on the podcast, which is critical right now, given the current state of the industry, at least if you enjoy this content that we're producing. At the very least, just consider heading over to patreon.com/Brülosophy to check it out. If you end up making a pledge, just know that you are the reason we're here. And if not, we love you all the same. And we do have other less overt ways for you to help us out, like using the links on Brülosophy.com/support when shopping online. Your experience doesn't change at all, and we get a little kickback for the referral. And if you wouldn't mind, please take a few seconds to leave a rating and review of this show in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts that allows you to leave ratings and reviews, because that helps those who may not be familiar with us yet to more easily find the show. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who are known for their incredible all-in-one electric brewing systems. I've brewed on both their 120 and 240 volt systems, and I'm telling you, these things are legit, efficient, easy to use with a relatively small footprint. You're not going to be disappointed with one of these units. Plus, the guys behind the company run an amazing YouTube channel, which you can find by searching YouTube for Clawhammer Supply. If you're in the market for electric brewing gear or even just reasonably priced kettles and such, make sure to check out what Clawhammer Supply has to offer at clawhammersupply.com. And don't forget to let them know Brülosophy sent you when you're checking out. That's clawhammersupply.com. Listener Evan Arena wrote in with some feedback on something we've talked quite a bit about on the show over the last few years. He said, first, the question: why should we, homebrewers, care about the level of interest in homebrewing as a hobby? To expand, I don't see brewing going anywhere as a hobby. There will still be hops, yeast, and malt available at some level, regardless of how much interest drops. I'm curious why there's been a consistent theme on your podcast decrying the slowdown of interest in brewing. My take is that we don't need people to like what we like. I like brewing for brewing's sake. Well, Evan, while I appreciate your opinion on this matter, as you likely predicted, I don't fully agree with it. Why do I care? Well, it'd take me several episodes to fully explain that, in part because my, quote, care is rooted in my own personal philosophy, the way I view life in general. I'm not just focused on the beer or the fun of brewing, but really it's the people who enjoy it and the reasons why they're leaving. There's no denying that some people have stopped drinking craft beer and brewing their own beer due to health concerns and stuff like that. And you will never hear me speak negatively about that or even try to persuade these folks to come back. It's just not the way I roll. But what you may not be aware of are the reasons that I've heard from many, many people for leaving brewing altogether and even the craft beer bubble. And it's that they felt marginalized as somebody who isn't a middle-aged white bearded dude, like me, and statistically speaking, probably you, Evan. That not only sucks for someone like me who gets some value out of seeing this hobby that I love so much thrive, but it's also just so fucking stupid. Not on, the people leaving, but on those of us who aren't doing what we can to make this hobby more welcoming and appealing to a broader range of people. Look, I don't get into my personal beliefs very often on this show, but I would hope that who I am is conveyed in the way that the approach that we take over here at Brülosophy. To put it bluntly, I think hatred and judgment and all of those things in any form really is just pathetic, capital P pathetic. And it's maddening to me that we live in a world where those responsible for leading us so childishly encourage these characteristics. It's awful to me. Yeah, I know some of you disagree with me on that. Perhaps your feelings are hurt because somebody you've come to enjoy listening to talk about beer at least, is speaking up about their thoughts about life in general. I don't know what to say other than deal with it. If you don't want to listen to us because I'm sharing some opinions that don't have to do with beer, then by all means, go find some other show to listen to. If you like where we're at right now, enjoy what you're dealing with. I don't like it at all. So it's certainly not my point now to presume anything about you, Evan. You were just the lucky listener who asked the question that sort of opened the door for me to be more frank about these things than I usually am, at least on the podcast here. So I care because caring matters to me. I care because I don't want anybody feeling left out or like they don't fit into a hobby as cool as brewing when the reasons that they don't fit in are because of people like me not welcoming them. I think that's bullshit. And so that is my response. Thank you for asking that question, Evan. Again, it did allow me to open the door to kind of get some of those thoughts out. And if anybody who knows me, IRL in real life, they know that I am often biting my tongue, not sharing these things. So this is my show. I can do what I want on it. And so that's what I'm using this opportunity to do. Be kind, be good, love others. That's my philosophy. All right. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brülosophy.com or leave us a note on social media. Don't forget to snag yourself some Brülosophy merch. This is yet another way you can help support us. You could find it at brülosophy.com/shop. We are offering more options than we ever have before, from t-shirts, hoodies, and hats to fanny packs, shorts, coffee mugs, tank tops, mobile phones, stickers, and many other things. We've done our best to keep prices reasonable, and international shipping is available. Again, head to brülosophy.com/shop. Click one of the product images on that page, and you'll be redirected to our Dashery store, or you can go directly there, brülosophy.dashery.com. There's a link in the description of this episode.
I'm here on the job site with Dale, who's a framing contractor.
Hey, good morning.
Dale traded up to Geico Commercial Auto Insurance for all his business vehicles. We're here where he needs us most.
Yep, they sure are.
We make it easy for him to save on all his insurance needs, all in one place, with coverage that fits his business and bottom line. Oh, I shouldn't have looked down.
It's all right.
We're so far up here.
Look at me. Take a deep breath.
No, I'm good. So good.
Get a commercial auto insurance quote today at geico.com and see how much you could save. It feels good to Geico.
Stop guessing and start perfecting your craft with Brewfather, the ultimate tool for recipe design. Brewfather Premium unlocks advanced inventory tracking, tilt integration for real-time fermentation monitoring, and seamless cloud sync across all of your devices. But wait, there's more. Premium Plus just changed the game with Brewfather's brand new AI recipe integration. Whether you're looking to clone a rare commercial classic or need a creative spark for a unique grain bill, Brewfather AI helps you build balanced, world-class recipes in seconds. Brewing is a science. Make it art with Brewfather Premium Plus by visiting brewfather.app today. That's brewfather.app. Better beer is just a click away. Huge thanks to our patrons who submitted their Brü A questions for this episode. Again, I'm going to be doing this alone, so I guess I'm offering a bit of a disclaimer. First off, it's just me, so we're probably going to make it through a few more questions than we usually do, but also I don't like to prepare my answers to these ahead of time. Ask the other co-hosts who have done these Brü A's with me. I'm usually, responding to them off the cuff because I feel like that adds a little bit, a little bit of a dose of genuineness, I suppose. So again, forgive me if I fumble around a little bit. I don't have any support here today. So the first question comes from Nicholas Hubbard, who says, in having a few conversations with folks who make brewing equipment, my understanding is that many of these companies are struggling. Are you concerned that we'll see the innovation and progress for equipment on the homebrew scale begin to fade as the demand for homebrewing equipment goes down? Will we go back to the days of cooler mash tuns, kegels, and glass carboys? Oh, good question, Nicholas. I apologize. I do I'm already seeing that. I don't know how else to put this. There are various metrics that I can use to sort of judge the state of the gear industry side of things. One of the ones that we've got, given what we do here at Brülosophy, is advertising. Not even just in terms of dollars, but just in terms of sponsors. Each one being an individual. We've lost most of our sponsors because of the downturn in the industry. And some of those sponsors are completely gone already. They're out of business. They're not even in the market of brewing anymore. They're not making the gear that they used to make. Now, there's economical arguments for that potentially being an okay thing. It still sucks for me when those folks became my friends. Do I think that the demand is gonna cause there to be, I guess, a paucity of new gear? Absolutely. I think we're already seeing that. But I think it's also cool to see some of the more established companies out there producing new gear, like Clawhammer Supply. They're making some cool stuff despite the state of the industry. And I really love how Kyle from Clawhammer is so willing to get his voice out there and put his face on YouTube, talking about the impact that some stupid political decisions are having on the market right now. Businesses thrive, or survive, I should say, off of making money. That's the way it works. And when you have to pay more for the raw materials that you're receiving in order to provide those, make and provide the gear that you're known for to customers, then those customers have to pay more. That's just how tariffs and such work. It's stupid to think otherwise. Are we going to see a downturn? Yes. I do have hope, and maybe I'm just being Pollyannish about this, that we're going to start to see a gradual ramp up, and we won't return in my lifetime to the levels that we were at 10 years ago in terms of interest in home brewing and craft beer, but it's going to improve from where we're at. I'm pretty confident about that. We're already starting to see some leveling off. I don't want to get into the details there, at least from my side of things, but it does look like things are going to start to go back up. Now, you asked if we're going to go back to the days of cooler mash tuns, kegels, and glass carboys. Did we ever leave those days? I know here at Brülosophy, a lot of us, saved up money and bought gear. We got some sponsored gear, admittedly, that we were able to kind of show off and encourage other people to go out and pick up. But I know I have plenty of friends who are still mashing in converted cooler mash tuns and boiling in cheaper kettles that don't have any fancy connections on them or anything. I have one friend who still swears by glass carboys even. So yeah, I don't know if there's anything. I'm fully convinced there's nothing wrong with those more rudimentary quote home brewing types of setups. Do what you can. If you have the cash to drop on something a little bit more sophisticated, then by all means, I have no problems with that either. So, but yeah, I do think we're going to see, or we have seen, a kind of drop off in interest in the higher end, or I guess more geeky type of gear out there. But I am happy to say that there are still some companies who are producing, at the very least, continuing to sell what we've come to expect from them. And maybe they're not innovating as much as they would have been had, interest remained what it was 10 years ago, but they're still, available out there at reasonable prices for those who want to get into the kind of higher end gear stuff. So, all right. Patron Espin asks, does your revenue from inserted ads change depending on how many people listen to them? I generally skip past the ads, but I'd happily let them run if you get a higher payout from that. Espin, yeah, I mean, that's just the way those dynamic ads work. If you skip through them, two things, from what I've read at least, I'm by no means consider myself an expert in this. Podcasters like me who work with podcasting networks like Believe, they manage all of that stuff on the back end. So I'm not, again, I have other stuff I got to focus on. I can't focus on the details of advertising, but it does absolutely contribute to covering the cost of producing this. And if you skip those ads, not only will you start hearing less of them overall, so if you really don't like them, keep skipping them, because you will get less ads played to you in all of the slots that we mark in each episode. But we're not getting any revenue just because they're in the show and you skip them. It tracks when you skip them. I can actually pull up a stats sheet that shows me how much of an episode was listened to, and there are some out there that even show you at what points they're skipped. And when you line it up, it's always the advertising spot. So to those who just listen through each episode and deal with the advertising, thank you, because it does help us out. Again, Patreon is our number one source of revenue. So if you're an ad skipper, I mean, go for it. You're not going to hurt our feelings over here. But if you're cool with just letting them play, I mean, that's another couple of cents in our pocket to help you, help us to keep producing this stuff. All right, David Coons asks, I've been brewing for 15 plus years, mostly someone else's recipes. I received a free pound of hop pellets of different varieties and would like to develop my own recipe using the different hops. How do you begin to formulate hop combinations for recipes? For every brewer, David, there is a different response to this question. I tend to be more willy-nilly because I'm okay with making beer that isn't world-class for the sake of experimenting and learning new things about it. I mean, look at what we do at Brülosophy. We this whole thing started with my willingness to make a batch of beer that I might have to dump. So that's the way I approach it. When I get a new hop variety, which they're still coming out with new hop varieties, even with the state of the industry, the way that I like to play around with it first, and I don't know, it sounds like you might have one free pound of hop pellets of different varieties. So maybe like a hop blend or something like that. Or this goes for even if you just have separate, 1 pound bags of different hop varieties. I have a recipe that I go to over the last few years. That's been our very, very simple Hop Chronicles Pale Ale recipe. That is, I think, 90% Pilsner malt and like 10% Vienna malt or something. Very simple, fermented with the Chico strain. I aim for about 1052 OG. And then I just do a real basic hop schedule that I do every time I'm testing hops out so that I can just kind of have a standardized beer that I'm testing those hops in so I get some idea of it. And then once I sample that beer and I get an idea of what that hop variety is contributing to it, I just start messing around in my mind with what I think that would go well with based on what I know about other hop varieties. I might reference some other recipes of people who have used the hops that I've got, but I'm usually not copying recipes or brewing other people's. I've been doing this for a long time. I have an idea of what works for me and what I like. So every recipe I make is 100% my own. But here's the thing. There's not that many options out there for the recipes for a specific style. You're going to be awfully close to somebody else's recipe anyways. Don't feel bad about that. Copying somebody else's recipe is not copying their beer. You brewing it on its own is likely going to contribute with your water and your approach and all of that is likely going to contribute its own characteristics anyways. Those hops, same deal. You can use the same hops as me. We could brew side by side at our different houses, and chances are you're going to have a different outcome, but also perception of what those hops do, level of preference for that hop variety. So, what I would suggest, if you really are afraid of having to dump 5 gallons, just make a 1 gallon batch, scale down a recipe, create a standardized, very simple recipe to learn more about hop varieties, scale it down from 5 gallons to 1 gallon. And, you get a 6-pack out of that, and then you'll learn more about those hops. So that's my response to that one. Craig Fraser says, do you cook with beer? I'd like to start using some of my homebrew to cook with. Do you have any experience using beer as an ingredient? And do you have any good recipes or advice to share? Well, Craig, I will tell you this. When I cook, I'm usually drinking a beer, yes, but I have not, in the hundreds and hundreds, almost 600 batches that I've brewed since 2003, I have never once that I can recall used beer to make food. That's not to say that I'm against it. I've gone to several restaurants that we've got plenty of local beer, kind of beer focused restaurants here where I live that make absolutely delicious food products with beer, whether it's beer cheese or some sort of a marinade that they soak their meat in for a while or whatever. I'm totally for it. It just never crosses my mind to do it. But there are a lot of people out there that I know who really enjoy that, the amalgamation of food and beer and blending those two loves into one single product as opposed to being kind of an accessory for me, So have at it. I would suggest just Googling it. I mean, we have so much information at our fingertips. Look what people are posting on different forums. Ask those people who are brewing successfully with beer or cooking with beer. Ask them what they're doing and what they would recommend, and then start your journey of cooking with beer. I think it's awesome. For me, I'd rather drink it than cook with it. All right. Sean Bernard says, I swear I cannot get a straight answer. Oh boy. On yeast starters, ask one person, they're mandatory for every batch. Ask another person, and they're part of a bygone era of homebrewing when yeast technology wasn't as awesome as it is today. Most people say it depends on the style you're brewing, the type of yeast, how old it is, OG, fermentation temperature, if mercury is in retrograde, if a butterfly flapped its wings in Belgium, or any of a host of other nebulous reasons. Where do you stand on yeast starters? This is a great question. Back in, I believe it was late 2010, I bought all of the gear that I needed, including a stir plate, a 2-liter Erlenmeyer flask, eventually got a 5-liter one for lagers, a whole bunch of DME, and I was making yeast starters for every batch of beer that I brewed. Now, some might argue, what you said, Sean, about people claiming that, yeast has come a long way. And 10 years ago, 16 years ago, when I started making yeast starters, people were saying the same thing, that yeast had really come a long way from just a tiny little pouch underneath the top of a can of LME or whatever. It's come even further today, in my opinion. But that doesn't, I guess, take away the, I don't want to say need or necessity, but the benefits that you can get from making a yeast starter. If you just take Brülosophy, for example, the contributors here, and you ask each one of us, there's 6 of us actively contributing right now. Do you make yeast starters? I think we only have one who would consistently say yes to that question. That person will also occasionally not make a yeast starter, but he's pitching several pouches of yeast, which isn't cheap. I was just editing one of his articles, and he pitched 3 pouches of imperial yeast per experiment batch. So for one brew day, he used 6 pouches of yeast. That is over $70 of yeast. That's not a very economical thing, but he's doing it to, get to the proper pitch rates. So for me, whether you're making starters or not isn't really the issue. That's just a tool that you can use to get to the proper pitch rate. All of us at Brülosophy more or less agree that pitching, the right amount of yeast, viable yeast, is important. We're fortunate enough to be sponsored by Imperial Yeast, so we get insanely fresh yeast. I've used yeast that is 3 weeks off the tank at Imperial, and that has 200 billion cells. My hunch is it probably has a little bit more than that, which works for nearly every style of beer that I want to make. Now, if I'm making a lager that I'm going to cold ferment, I might pitch 2 pouches of yeast. I might throw it into a starter the night before. So really the key isn't necessarily yeast starters. And again, Sean, this is just my opinion, man. All of those opinions that you're hearing from other people, they're just their opinions as well. That's what hobbies are full of, opinions. Mine is that it's more important to pay attention to your pitch rate than it is to pay attention to the starter. The starter doesn't do anything magical except for increase your viability, increase the yeast cell count, and that is the key. So yes, if I need to, I will make a yeast starter. I will say this little secret. I'm not even sure if this is going to go public on the website, but I recently brewed a batch of beer that I didn't make a yeast starter for, and you can kind of guess where this is headed. And I used, some yeast that maybe was a bit longer in the tooth than it should have been. And I'm not convinced that batch worked out. And I have made, in my day, I have made 2 dumpers. One of them was a beer that I intended to be a dumper. The other was an experimental beer where I tried to propagate yeast to discover, WLP 090. And number 3 will be this one if it doesn't clean up here in the next couple of weeks. So should I have made a starter? I'm starting to think I wish I would have in that case, because I underpitched that beer and it kind of tastes like it was underpitched. So it's yeast pitch rate, not the starter. The starter is just a tool to help you get to that yeast pitch rate. That's my opinion. All right, Dennis Niehoff says, I recently brewed a Schwartz beer that had a great flavor but was lacking something in regards to drinkability. I was cooking, had a lemon lying around, and decided to dose my beer with a few drops of lemon juice in the glass. Suddenly, my Schwartz beer got this drinkability that I want in a lager. Since that moment, I'm obsessed with trying to acidify my homebrews in the glass to see if they profit from a lower pH. Do you have any experience with acidifying your beer in the glass? I'm aware that you used fruit syrups in the past. I guess this isn't totally different. I'm not sure if I've had like some trial, samples of fruit syrups that I got at different conferences that I dosed like a Berliner Weiss with and stuff, but I've never used fruit syrups necessarily for acidification of finished beer. I have, however, several times added a drop of lactic acid or even a few drops of phosphoric acid to a finished beer, just again, out of experimentation, wanting to see what it does to the beer. And you're absolutely right, Dennis. That acidity, when you drop that pH even just a little bit, to where you're not necessarily tasting the lactic or phosphoric acid. You're not getting that tartness, but it is sharpening that I guess that flavor, it really does have an impact in my opinion. Now, I don't think it's convenient to make a beer and then dose every single glass with acid. And that's why you see a lot of brewers out there, I think, dosing their finished beer. They're testing it, tasting it, and then if they feel like it needs a little bit more acidity, they can acidify the beer at packaging, whatever it might be. We've done experiments on this. You might want to go search that on the website to see what the outcomes of those were. But yeah, acidifying beer is going to make certain flavors pop. And if that's what you're looking for, particularly in like pale lagers, I mean, you commented on a Schwartz beer. I can't imagine the blend of lemon flavor with Schwartz beer being that good, but maybe you're figuring something amazing out here. It will absolutely make those flavors pop. So you do you. If you want to dose every glass individually, by all means, but you can also just dose the whole beer. Now, one of the interesting things that a trend that I've noticed over the years that I've been messing around with water chemistry and in particular pH, when you're adjusting the mash pH, that doesn't really seem to carry over into the finished beer pH. I think your starting water chemistry does have an impact on that. But malt has just such a strong buffering capacity that it's usually going to level out, even when you compare like a 100% Pilsner malt beer to say a stout. Yes, those roasted grains are more acidic. They're going to pull that mash pH down. But once you get into the boil and you start adding your hops and doing all of that, it really does seem to squeeze the differences closer together. And so that's something you want to keep in mind. If you like a beer that has a slightly lower pH, I wouldn't go too low. Otherwise, you're making sour beer that will taste artificially sour. Then yeah, you feel free to acidify the entire keg of your beer, or when you're at bottling, you can just add a little bit of acid to reduce that acidity. So, or increase the acidity, I suppose, reduce the pH. All right, Johnny Taylor says hundreds of malts, hundreds of hops, hundreds of yeasts, with new products being released all the time. How do you deal with the overwhelming choice when designing a recipe or even working out what style to brew? Well, Johnny, I'm a simpleton. I stick with the basics for the most part. If the only time I'm using like new malts is when I discover that there's a new malt and I read about it and it sounds like it might have a place in a beer that I'm planning already. I don't think I've ever designed a beer specifically around a new ingredient outside of hops, but like I said earlier, I use the same recipe, a hop test type of recipe for all new hops just to get an idea of what they do anyways. So, I'm not entirely sure I'm the best person to answer this question, Johnny. That it's just, I don't overthink it. If I get a bag of malt and I have a bunch of hops and I have some sort of a yeast, actually more than anything, I think most people probably do this. You determine the type of beer you're going to make based in part on the yeast that you have available. So if I've got, A09 Pub, which is the fuller strain sitting in my fridge, and I want to use that, I'm probably going to make an English ale, or I really love that yeast in hoppy American style IPA. I might go that route. If I've got Belgian yeast sitting in the fridge, that's going to determine more, about my recipe than the grains or the hops. Let's say I've got a Belgian yeast sitting around in my fridge and I want to make a nice, Belgian Golden Strong, something like that. But all I've got is pale two-row malt that was grown in the Midwest of America. I don't care. I'll use that for a Belgian. I might find, I might have some Willamette hops that I throw into that Belgian beer as well. It doesn't bother me. So I'm not overthinking it too much, but I get the question. There is so much variety out there in terms of just the ingredients that we have available to us these days. And I think that's awesome. People are discovering new things that might not even be that new every day because they're just trying it out. So yeah, give it a go. I mean, if the other great thing about the world we live in today is we have the internet. I mean, go find other people who have used these ingredients that you are interested in trying out and see what they have to say about it. I wouldn't accept everything they say as like 100% truth. It's their opinion. So that's all we have to offer most of this stuff. So, all right. Final question for this segment comes from Joseph Rosenblatt, who says, I was intrigued by your recent video on ginger beer. I have 5 pounds of corn sugar that I decided to leave out of my last couple of batches and was thinking of making a seltzer with it. I currently have a Pliny the Elder clone fermenting with a buttload of dry hops. I was thinking of fermenting the seltzer right on the yeast cake after I transfer the Pliny out to make a hoppy seltzer. Do you think this will work? I've never had a hoppy seltzer, but with all of the dry hops at the bottom, I'd think there'd still be a decent amount of hop flavor and aroma carried over to the seltzer. Well, Joseph, you may not have had a hoppy seltzer, but if you've ever had hop water, that's basically what a hoppy seltzer is, and they are surprisingly good. So regardless of, we're going to get to your question specifically here in a minute, but hop water on its own is awesome, and it's very easy to make. You can Google hop water. You could search it up on Brülosophy.com. We have several articles, experiments that we've done, all sorts of stuff on hop water. A very simple, easy, and deliciously refreshing beverage there. Now, to your question about fermenting seltzer, so basically sugar water, on a yeast cake from a prior batch that had a lot of hops in it, that those hops were allowed to fall out and go into that trub. Do I think that will contribute hop character? I've never done it, so I can only speculate here, but my speculation is based on several batches of beer that I've made using either the full yeast cake or just pulling what I call sloppy slurry, out of the fermenter and not rinsing it or anything like that before pitching it into another beer. I've never had flavor carryover, but you have to keep in mind I'm making beer, and beer has a lot more flavor than water. So you're piquing my interest in an idea here, Joseph. I could see if you make a really hoppy beer, you dry hop the hell out of it, or you use a buttload of dry hops, as you said. And those dry hops, obviously a good chunk of those are going to remain in that yeast cake or in that trub. That throwing on some sugar water and allowing that to ferment, why wouldn't you pick up some hop character? I don't think that's, far-fetched. Do I think the hop character is going to be pungent enough to be enjoyable? I do not. And again, that's because most of the hop oils and stuff that you were after went into the beer that you made before. But I could be completely wrong about that. Again, these are interesting questions. This is what keeps us going. Now you've piqued my interest. You've given me an idea for a future experiment that I'm looking forward now to performing, because this is an interesting question. Again, my opinion based on my experience is that no, you're not going to get that much of hop character, even though you might get a little bit. To me, when you have just a little of something that you want a lot of, it's almost unenjoyable. I'd rather have it not there at all. So be wary of that. But here's the cool thing. Make that beer, try it out, or that hop water, I apologize. Try it out. If it's not hoppy enough, throw some dry hops in. It's as simple as that. So you can fix it. If you do this, Joseph, please report back to us, because I'm fascinated to hear if this works at all. The closest experiment that I can think of off the top of my mind is one that Will Lovell performed, where he racked I believe it was a Helles onto the yeast cake that previously was used to ferment a Rauch beer to see if he got a smoky character out of it. And if I recall correctly, he did. So again, that was one I didn't think was going to have a big impact. It really did seem to have a noticeable impact to the point that tasters could tell it apart. So your mileage may vary and it may be different with hops, but definitely a pathway for exploration in the future. All right, thanks to everybody who asked those questions. We've got to take a short break. We will be right back with more Brü A. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of work, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Time to answer some more questions submitted by patrons of Brülosophy. This one comes from Mike Rauka, who says, I'm a relatively new homebrewer, under 2 years, and I'm really loving it. One of the issues I'm facing is that I travel for work and I'm often home for a few days, then out for 6 weeks or more. Wow, 6 weeks or more. I've had decent success so far with letting my beers sit on the yeast cake for that time, then getting home and kegging, especially fermenting under pressure, he says. My question is, are there any styles that you know of that lend themselves well to sitting on a yeast cake for that long, or any styles where this is preferred? Preferred, I don't know, like bigger beers. I mean, you could I'm not a big fan of like triple IPA or anything like that, but if you are, you could always dry hop it as soon as you're home, keg it a day or two later, and then you have a nice big double or triple IPA that's got fresh hop character. When I make stronger Belgian beers, so anything from like a double all the way up to like a quad, triple, those types of beers, I feel like they do benefit from spending a little bit more time on the yeast cake. Again, I'm not letting them sit for 6 weeks, but hey, I don't think you're going to have any issues. We talked about the quality of yeast earlier in this episode. You're not going to get, in my experience at least, you're not going to get notable or noticeable characteristics of, say, autolysis or anything like that from letting your beer sit on the yeast cake for 6 weeks. That's just not long enough for that really to take effect. If you're racking a bunch of Trub to your fermenter, you might want to be cautious about doing that. The only Trub experiment that I've performed personally that came back significant was when I used I racked all of the Trub from the kettle into the fermentation vessel and then let it age on that yeast cake. The yeast cake was way thicker than the control batch, which had very little, I believe I tried to reduce as much Trub as possible in that one. It was way thicker. It just had this kind of rubbery, gross flavor to it that I wasn't a fan of. So if you have to leave it for that long and you're racking all of your Trub to the fermenter, I would probably shy away from really pale, delicate styles like Kolsch or Pilsner or most pale lagers. But if you're making, amber ale, or you're making a brown ale, you're making, let's say, a stout, a Russian Imperial stout, something big like that, I actually think that would work out really well. You're going to ensure at the very least that beer is well attenuated, because it's likely after 6 weeks, there's not going to be much, work for those yeast to do. So if you're making those bigger beers, to refer back to something we talked about earlier, make sure you're pitching the right amount of yeast. You don't want to spend all that time away thinking about coming home and drinking this delicious beer to get back and have it, taste like rubber or burnt tires or something like that. So styles that are preferred for that, I don't think anybody would be like, oh, there's a great style to just keep on your yeast, unless you are making more traditional approach to, say, classic sour beer, like a Flemish Red or an Oud Bruin. I have had good luck pitching a yeast microbe blend, something like Rosalaire from Y Yeast, and just letting that sit for a year and a half. But 6 weeks, you're not going to have much luck with one of those either. So I think you can make most styles in that time frame and not even have an issue with it. It's just for the hoppier stuff, you're going to want to consider dry hopping it before you package it, probably before you do any sort of cold crashing and stuff, just to get that fresh hop character in there. All right. Charles Myers says, I'm a home brewer in Tokyo and have always vacuum sealed and frozen my hops after opening. However, I recently toured a local brewery and the brewer told me he prefers storing hops in the brewery cool room or refrigerator rather than the freezer, and that this is actually better for the hops. For both commercial brewers and home brewers, is there actually a best practice here? Is freezer storage preferable for long-term freshness and oil preservation, or is cold refrigeration enough if the hops are used relatively quickly? Also, are there any downsides to freezing hops repeatedly after opening and resealing? Okay, couple questions here. First off, is refrigerator better than freezer? I don't think so. Do I think there's a big difference? Not at all. If you go to Yakima during hop harvest and you go into their cold storage rooms, they are freezers. It is freezing cold. I believe the last one I was at, if I recall correctly, they held at 35 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 1.5, 2 degrees C, something like that. They're super cold, and their comment to me is the colder you can keep it, the longer, the longer the shelf life of these hops. And there is, it's the same thing with warmth. The warmer things get, the shorter that shelf life is going to be, the more chance for chemical reactions to occur. The colder you keep it, the less likely those reactions are going to occur. It's sort of linear, I guess. So I think it's kind of weird for a professional brewer to tell somebody that it's better to keep them in the fridge. I've never seen any evidence suggesting that whatsoever. It's probably just anecdote to confirm their own their own approach and what they're doing, and that's fine. Now, almost every commercial brewery that I've got friends, who work at, they just keep their hops in their cold storage, where they keep their kegs and stuff like that. They're not keeping them in freezers because they already have the cold storage. Why build a whole freezer for an extra, 15 degrees? I think most cold storages at breweries are around 36 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit anyways. So that's basically a refrigerator. A freezer is going to be down closer to 0 degrees or below 32 degrees at the very least. But ideally, you're pushing that 0 degree, 1 degree Fahrenheit, temperature for a freezer. I don't think you're getting that big of a benefit regardless of what you do. Also, brewers tend to use hops pretty quickly, faster than we do at least. So they don't have to worry about things like shelf life in the way that we do, where I buy a pound of hops and they're going to be around in my freezer for 6 months to a year for the most part, unless I'm just using those hops. So, I don't think that's I think that's kind of a fallacious comment that your brewery friend shared with you. Again, likely for confirmation bias reasons, but yeah, that's my opinion. All right, Tyler Vanderhoff said, I recently started listening to your podcast after getting into the hobby just last year. Well, thanks, Tyler. He says, I've really enjoyed and benefited from your content, but a few things I always wonder are, 1, how do you pick experiments? 2, who's going to do them? And 3, what makes it on the podcast versus YouTube versus an article? Organizing groups of people for a common cause is hard work, so I'm interested to know how you navigate all of that with so much content. Well, Tyler, it has been something that has taken shape over the entirety of Brülosophy's existence, which, reminder, we got off the ground in February of 2014. So we've been doing this for over 12 years at this point. And, I'm happy to say that the way that we've been doing things, I'd say since COVID, no joke, up until COVID. So like the first 8 to almost 10 years of our existence, it really was kind of, experimenting. How can we do this? Do we need more contributors? Do we need this? We have honed the way that we approach things now. And then I'll be honest, a large part of the reason for the way we do things today is because of the state of the industry. It's because of the impact that COVID had on us. We learned a lot throughout that process. But we've got like I said, a nice team, 5 to 6 contributors actively contributing at any given time. And each one of them, to answer your first question, when we settle on an experiment to do, it's usually proposed by the contributor who wants to perform that experiment. Now, we have a kind of an agreement that should an idea come to mind and somebody want to perform it, that they need to first workshop it with the group before they go and brew the beers for it. And that's only the reason we do that is so that we can make sure that we're isolating the variable in the best way possible. And that, there are no issues that could potentially come up that would have been easily fixed had we, worked on it together. So the contributor who you sees the name on the article, they're usually the one who proposed the experiment, and those experiments, that's who does them. How do we pick them? It's usually either some new idea that we've seen talked about online or that we've heard about from, another a contributor read it somewhere or heard about it from a brewing friend or something. It's getting a lot of focus. Or, we're still going back and testing kind of age-old ideas about brewing, stuff that we've been told you have to do in order to make a good batch of beer. We've probably tested 99% of those claims so far at this point. But reiteration, replication, that is the name of the game, and there's nothing to lose by continuing to replicate beer. So what makes it on the podcast versus YouTube versus just an article? So everything that we talk about on the podcast was an article first for the most part. Brü A, obviously not. But if our experiment episodes, and this is very intentional, we are talking about experiments that we've already performed and published on the website. And the reason we do that is that when we talk about it, we're sharing information, opinions, ideas outside of what's included in the article, which we used to get asked about all the time. So in a way, the podcast was our way of providing this thing that our readers were asking for. And So the other cool thing about it, though, is that we always put the link to that article so that you can reference the article that we're talking about in each of those episodes. The same goes for other series, the Short and Shoddy series, stuff like that. Brü's Views, we don't really publish those on the website. We used to for a minute, but for the most part, the experiments are picked by the contributor who ends up brewing them. It's usually inspired by something they found online or something that's already out there in the world, it makes it on the show because we're interested. Oh, and by the way, people ask this surprising amount of time. How do when you have a different co-host on, how do you pick the experiment you're going to talk about? It's usually an experiment that co-host performed. If it's not, it's an experiment that either I performed a while ago or that one of the contributors who's no longer contributing performed, and we just haven't addressed on the show yet. We do try to spread out the topics, so we try not to do like fermentation temperature several weeks in a row or, some mash related variable several weeks in a row. That's just to keep things interesting and, little variety. So Todd McCagg says, let's say you've graduated to kegging. You're getting good at oxygen-free transfers and using the Brülosophy gelatin findings. We do not have our own branded Brülosophy, but we do really like gelatin finding. Your beers are clear. Keeping it simple, you've got 2 beers kegged in the fridge. One is an Old Peculiar, which is happily carbed at 8 psi. The other is an American Wheat, which is much happier at 12 psi. If serving pressure is 10 psi and you only have one CO2 tank, does every keg get set to 10 psi for serving? Then it needs to be reset back to 8 and 12 respectively. I'm assuming you mean for carbonating, Todd. He says, I'm lost. I feel like the gauges guy in a steam locomotive. Okay. You are, this is a common issue among people who, let's say, build their first kegerator or buy their first kegerator, and they have just got one regulator on the CO2 tank that is maybe going to a very simple and, inexpensive CO2 manifold that you cannot adjust each manifold on. Some might say that you're overthinking it, Todd. If that's the case, then I'm an overthinker, and that inspired me to spend money on certain gear that I'll tell you about in a minute. But let's say that's all you've got is the manifold with your single gauge, a regulator on your CO2 tank. Yes, essentially what you laid out is how you would do that. And the way I used to do, I only did this when I had a 2-tap kegerator. As soon as I built my 7-tap kegerator, I went away from this approach. But what I would do is when I was carbonating a beer, I like to burst carbonate. I'd bump my primary regulator, the one attached to the CO2 tank. I'd bump that up to 60 PSI, run that into the manifold and, open up the manifold on a brand new beer and let that carbonate. And while it was carbonating, I just didn't drink the other keg. Now, remember, burst carbonating is like a 15 to 24 hour at most, in my experience at least, process. So you're really that other beer is out of commission just for a night, essentially. And then the next day I would bump it down to serving pressure, which I always make my line length, my beer line length, that which allows me to keep a serving pressure that will, if needed over time, effectively carbonate a beer. So I've got 15 foot of 4 millimeter EVA barrier beer line for all of my, I only have a 3-tap kegerator these days, but they all have that much so that I can actually serve at, 15, 16 PSI if I want, and I don't get a glass full of foam. It's nice and restricted. But that means that if I do make a beer that I don't feel like burst carbonating, I can just put it on gas at that serving pressure, and a week or two later, it's going to be nicely carbonated. So that's one approach that you can do. The whole 8 to 12 PSI serving pressure thing, I mean, unless you have really either, more than 3/16 inch OD beer line, or it's really short beer line, like less than 10 feet, that's really not going to make that big of a difference. On my system, if I were to go 10 PSI or lower, it would take over a minute. I might be exaggerating a little, close to a minute to fill a regular pint glass of beer. I mean, that's how slow it would flow out because of how long and how, restricted my EVA barrier 4 millimeter line is. So, I get what you're saying though. So what do I do now to avoid all of this altogether? Secondary regulators. They're not cheap. They're not that expensive, but they are certainly more so than a standard, regulator that everything is served at the same PSI. A secondary regulator is a secondary regulator. So you got your primary. You don't need a double gauge or anything like that. Just a single gauge primary regulator on your CO2 tank. You run it into the secondary. You keep that primary I keep mine at 60 PSI. And then I have a 3-way secondary. Each one of those runs to one of my faucets, right? And I can change those to whatever I want below 60 PSI. So I burst carbonate at 55 PSI now. So if I'm burst carbonating one beer, I just crank that specific regulator up to 55 PSI. I burst carbonate. I keep my other beers at 12 PSI serving pressure, and I'm good to go. So that is my, if you're willing to spend a little bit of coin response, just get secondary regulators. To me, it is such a valuable and worthy, piece of gear to have in your arsenal, in your kegerator. It is awesome. And I mean, you might spend $25, $30 more than you would on a cheap manifold. Maybe it's a little more than that these days. I built my last kegerator years ago, before tariffs and shit, but it is so convenient and so nice. I hear from people all the time who see one of my old kegerator builds. And they buy a secondary regulator and they email me saying, how did I not know about this sooner? I could not recommend secondary regulators more. If you're running more than, 2 kegs or so, it just makes things way more convenient. All right. Benji says, I'm newer to brewing beer and have been struggling a little with how to determine how much water should be in my kettle and how much sparge water I should be using. Any insight would be appreciated. Oh, Benji, I don't know if this is going to suffice as a response, but all of your water. That's not a recommendation. That is what I do. I used to have the same struggle that you did, and you'd hear about, grist to water ratio and yada, yada. We have not been able to flesh out any meaningful impact that sparging even has on beer. And that's why I, many years ago, switched over to full volume mashing, meaning I take 100% of the volume of the water that Brewfather spits out for a recipe that I build. I put that in the kettle, and then I drop a bag of grains in there, and I do brew in a bag. That it creates excellent beer every time. Well, unless I do something stupid to it. And it's just so easy. You don't have to worry about the details of water and grist ratios and all the stuff that you'll hear commercial brewers talk about. We brew on a homebrew scale, buddy. And there are so many things that make doing certain things easier for us that would be untenable for a commercial brewer. I was talking to a local friend of mine who brews beer and asking about, their setup and their mash tun and their whole setup. And, I said, it's so weird that commercial brewers or these home brewers tend to view that, if you want to make the best beer, you got to do it exactly how commercial brewers do it. And his response was, I only wish we could do full volume mashing in the brewery. I would do it every time. It's just so much easier. It saves a little bit of time. You're not heating sparge water, which, that takes energy. So that's my take on that. Just don't worry about it. If you don't have the volume in your kettle for mashing with all of the water, one of the tricks that I used to do to make it very simple was I would just cut the total brewing volume of water in half and mash with one, sparge with the other. I've done that several times. I have a buddy who did 80-20 because that's what fit in his mash tun. And if he was making a bigger beer and couldn't fit all of the water in the mash tun or even 80% of the water, he would fit what he could and then he'd reserve the rest and just sparge with that. I mean, you could batch sparge with it. You could fly sparge with that water. When you understand that the whole reason of sparging is just to rinse out a little bit more sugar so that, you reach that pre-boil gravity, then you can get away with if your fear is not getting enough conversion or whatever, not getting extracting enough sugar, you could just adjust your brew house efficiency down a little bit. You could add a little bit more grain. I mean, it's so easy to compensate for that kind of stuff. So I guess my response is just don't worry about it. Don't let that struggle bother you at all, Benji. You can do it however you want, and you're likely going to have a very similar, if not identical, outcome in that finished beer. All right. Tyson Sather says, what is your process when choosing grain for a recipe? I look at all the flavor descriptions on a maker's website and think, by maker, I believe he means the maltsters. But he says, I look at those descriptions and I think, that would be good. But then I actually brew with it and I don't feel like I get the same described flavors. This may be because I've never been taught how to translate flavor into words, or I just have a shoddy palate. He has a couple other questions that I'll get to here in a minute. But I think about this a lot, Tyson, that to me, the biggest indicator that people don't really have a good way to describe what it is that they're tasting is when they just use status quo descriptors that they heard somebody else say before. Perfect example is DMS, dimethyl sulfide. For the most part, it's an off flavor that has been historically associated with not boiling wort long enough, particularly when there's a high amount of low kiln like Pilsner malt making up that wort. I was always, you always heard people talk about DMS as tasting like canned corn. I never got canned corn in any beer that I've ever consumed. And even in the beers where I intentionally dosed them with real DMS flavor standard, they never tasted like corn at all to me. What it tasted like was a range of kind of a sickly, sweet, grainy character all the way up to ketchup. Not the vinegary part of ketchup, but that kind of cooked tomato, which I guess you could kind of lean into like a canned tomato type of an aroma, but it was never corn. So it's easy to pretend that we know these things that we really don't. Dunning-Kruger is alive and well. We all know that, particularly in hobbies like homebrewing, but you don't really know until you do it for yourself. So with that, we're talking about off flavors. When it comes to grain selection, just pick what you want to brew with and see how you describe it, how you perceive it, and just go with that. I've heard Maris Otter described by many people, I'm one of them, as having a sort of peanutty or almost peanut buttery character to it. If you don't perceive it that way, call it what you perceive. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm equivocal when it comes to these things. It's part of the reason that I struggle with judging competitions in the way that a lot of people like to judge, which is to be descriptive as opposed to evaluative, which is what judging should be in my mind. And they're saying, well, that has this character and that character. And I'm thinking, well, I didn't get that, So yeah, try them out. To me, I agree with you. We have done experiments. I did an experiment many years ago where I compared a Kraft Maltster's Vienna malt to their Munich malt, and side by side, these beers were very obviously different in terms of color. Tasters couldn't reliably distinguish those beers. Vienna malt and Munich malt are made somewhat similarly. It's just that one of them is kilned a little bit longer to become darker. And it can be very difficult, even when malts are noticeably different, to really tell them apart, particularly when you start throwing in things like, hops and yeast. So yeah, I hear what you're saying. I wouldn't worry too much about it. One of the easier, ways to approach recipe design with new malts and hops is just to use the malts in the way that they would normally be used in the style of beer that you're designing. If you're making a Helles, you're going to use a Pilsner malt. You want to try a new type of Pilsner malt, just pick it up and see what you think of it. That's at least how I approach it. So I try not to overthink these things. All right. A couple more fun questions from Tyson. He says, and like always, a second controversial question, answer the one you find more intriguing. He actually asked two and suggested that we only focus on one, or that I only focus on one. I'm going to just answer two because it'll be quick. The first one, this is fun, is the term crispy becoming a buzzword like juicy as a beer description? Becoming a buzzword? I think that it was a strong buzzword that has faded, at least to some degree, over the last couple of years. I don't hear it nearly as much. And while I couldn't care less that other people use it, it is one of the very few descriptive terms in beer that I always thought sounded so stupid. Just say crisp. You're adding a syllable where a syllable is not needed to be added. Unless you're just trying to fit in with other people who say that. I mean, that's the way I think of it. Now, again, I couldn't care less. If you say, I like crispy lagers or whatever, I'm not going to call you out on it. In my mind, I might be thinking, well, that sounded dumb. It's just my opinion though. I'm a language nerd. I try not The only reason I use the term crushable, this is kind of the alternative, is because somebody else said that they thought it sounded stupid. So there you go. I've got my reactive, response to that as well. I also think crushable actually makes a lot of sense when you think about what that means in the context of beer. I crush this beer. It's so crushable. Crispy to me is just a longer version of saying crisp. So I'm going to go with crisp 100% of the time. Juicy, that's another descriptive word that I think makes sense. You take a nice West Coast IPA that is super hoppy, and I've never had one where I would say, boy, that really is just juicy. No, it's fruity, and it has also some, heavy pine, some dankness. It's got all of these other characteristics. When I drink a good example of a hazy IPA, it's like having a slightly bitter juice in a glass. And that to me is juicy. And I'm not sure if there's a better simple term to use to describe that. So is it a buzzword? Yeah, maybe. It's one that I am okay with, whereas crispy, I just think sounds silly. So, okay. This is a good question too, Tyson. Are boneless chicken wings just chicken nuggets for adults? Yes, of course they are. And they're not even just for adults. When we were young, my kids were younger, and we would go out somewhere. If they didn't have nuggets on the menu, we would just order them boneless chicken wings if they had that. They are just chicken nuggets, usually with a sauce that is maybe geared towards people who like heat or sweet or whatever. So yeah, but there's nothing wrong with them. I prefer bone chicken wings, but if they don't have those and there's boneless, I'm not saying no to that. So. All right. Jim says, okay, man. Okay. Oh, okay. May is here. We are in May. Yes, Jim. Thus, it's time for Fresno to become ungodly hot, he says. So what is your favorite escape the heat places and their beer? Okay. This is starting to become a controversy locally here, I've realized. But my favorite place to go in town is Crow and Wolf. These guys are making awesome beer, but they also have a solid seltzer program. I am no hater of seltzer. This whole thing that people have where it's like beer and you got to only do beer and it's stupid if you do anything outside of beer and blah, 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 I'm going to judge you. I think you're kind of a dumbass for thinking that way. I'll be honest, because how else are these breweries going to survive when the market is demanding other things? Here's the cool thing. I didn't think I was going to be a big fan of seltzer. I go to Crow and Wolf, and they have got such a wide variety of seltzers that are not only very tasty, but they are so refreshing on these 105 degree Fahrenheit, Fresno Clovis days. They're so good. It brings in a completely different segment of consumers who are, hanging out and spending their money at these businesses that we don't want to see go belly up. So if you're going to whine about these places that don't, you see what I'm doing here, Jim? I'm using you as the jumping off point. If you're going to whine about places who are making things that you may not like to drink alongside things that you do like to drink, how about you just stop the whining and drink what you like and let the people who like the seltzers and the ciders and the wines drink what they have or what they enjoy so that company can stay in business. That's where my mind is. So anyways, that's my response to that. We've got some other cool places. Not my favorite place, but kind of a cool environment is Barrel House Brewing, which is over in a shopping center called River Park here in Fresno. It's cool, really cool. On cooler days, they'll open up their roll-ups and all of that. And they usually have like a live band playing in the evenings, and their beer's all right. They've got a cool little, bar shuffleboard thing in there, and we'll take the kids down there and let them kind of roam around and shop while Mom and I hang out and drink beer and seltzers and stuff like that. So other than that, I'm sitting at home drinking Miller Lite by the pool with my friends, and I have no shame in admitting that. All right, final question. And this is going to be a fun one. I got two questions on this. So WG first says, all right, let's talk sourdough. After listening to the latest Average Brew Review episode featuring your Tiny Bottom Pale Ale, I could not help but be intrigued by the most hyped up sourdough bagels ever. First off, they weren't that hyped up. It's just that Tim and Craig really like, handmade breads. So that's why they were talking like that. They are really good though. He says, seriously, they sound fantastic. Can you share your recipe and any insights you might have? Type of flour, percentages, any water adjustments. I've heard of people making water adjustments to mimic certain regions, similar to how we brew or we adjust beer water chemistry when brewing. I'm curious of your thoughts on this. Will Babcock Also echoed WG's interest in hearing more about my sourdough bagels, explaining that he recently moved to Asheville, North Carolina from New Jersey and discovered that, like pizza, there seems to be some big regional differences in terms of what people view as a good bagel. So here it is, my insanely simple sourdough bagel recipe, or at least the one that I've had really good success with so far. So for starters, I always go with baker's percentages, which is a ratio of all of the other ingredients to the amount of flour that you're using. And I tend to, whether I'm making a loaf, whether I'm making bagels, whether I'm making ciabatta or whatever it is, I almost always stick with 500 grams of flour because it makes getting the percentages really easy for me. And that usually does produce just the right amount of whatever it is I'm making that's going to last my family the subsequent week, so that I can just bake, once a week. And that's kind of the schedule that I'm on. So for the bagel recipe, now, I did not come up with this 100% by myself. What I did for this bagel recipe was, first off, I made the very first batch of bagels that I made were 100% based off of a highly rated recipe that I found online. I couldn't tell you where I found it. It was just a quick screen cap of it. I understand the sourdough process enough to where I just wanted to see the recipe and parts of the process because I'd never made bagels before. I made that recipe, was not a big fan of the way those bagels turned out. And so I started making adjustments. And by my, third or fourth batch of bagels, I was just so happy with the way they came out that I haven't made many changes to that recipe yet. And the batch that Tim and Craig tried I think that was my fifth batch, and I'm now on my seventh or eighth batch of bagels. So by no means an expert, but I do have at least some experience with this recipe, and it has consistently turned out what I feel are just excellent bagels, particularly when they're, less than 3 days old. I just had a bagel that I made last weekend, and it was excellent once toasted. They do get a little bit more dense, but what bagels don't? All right, here we go to the recipe. First off, you're going to blend 100 grams of active sourdough starter. That is 20% because I'm using 500 grams of flour. But the way I like to start it is 100 grams of active sourdough starter into 255 grams of warm water. That's 51% hydration. I use filtered water. You asked if I'm adjusting the water chemistry. No, I'm not at all. That might be something I experiment with in the future. And if I do that, I'll do my best to remember to make a video of it. Sourdough clearly has piqued some interest. So we're at 51% hydration with water, 20% starter, which is a little bit higher than what some people like to use when they're making just a standard, rustic loaf of sourdough bread. Add 40 grams of honey. That's 8% honey to that 500 grams of flour. So you're going to combine the sourdough starter, the warm water. I like to get my water to about 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And what I do is I just pull it from my filtered water from the fridge, about half of it. I throw it in the microwave for a minute. I weigh that out, and I weigh everything. I use grams for everything. Grams are the same as milliliters. Don't worry about that. Put the hot water in the bowl, and then I add cold water until I reach the 255 grams of what ends up being warm water. That 40 grams of honey, I stir all of that to combine really well. So you've got the sourdough starter, the water, and the honey all in the bowl and being combined. I tare my scale and then I add my salt. It's 2% salt. So in this case, that would be just 10 grams of salt. I like to use kosher salt. For whatever reason, I feel like it dissolves quicker and it works better for me. And so then I mix all of that together. And then once it's all combined, I add my flour, 500 grams of bread flour. 90% of the time I'm using King Arthur, unless the store that my wife buys our King Arthur at is all out. And then I'll run to the grocery store and pick up Bob's Red Mill bread flour. I've had great success with that. I can't really tell a difference. Maybe in the future, I'll do a side-by-side comparing those two, but that's your dough. So I mix all of that together. Once it's real shaggy, I don't leave it shaggy. I'll wet my hand and I'll go in and try to squeeze any dry bits to make sure that there just are as few as possible. This is going to be a stiffer dough. You're just at 51% hydration. I mean, that is quite stiff. My regular sourdough loaves, I go 65% hydration. I know people who like to go up to 80% hydration. 51%. Very, very stiff dough, very, very easy to work with. And mind you, there's honey in there. So the yeast that are in your starter are also going to be coaxed along by some of that honey. The honey, the main reason for the honey though, is to provide a touch of sweetness to the bagel, which is apparently a thing that you're looking for in bagels. So once that dough is well blended together, and again, no major dry bits of flour are left in it, I let it sit for half an hour, and then I perform the first set of stretch and folds. I repeat this 4 times. I know a lot of people who like to do just 3 sets of stretch and folds. I do 4. It's what works for me. I also know people who don't do any stretch and folds. I've done that as well. In my experience, you just have to let it bulk ferment a little bit longer because time will also develop gluten. Stretch and folds to me are just a fun part of the process. So that's what I do. After that 4th stretch and fold, I allow the dough in the bowl, the same bowl, to bulk ferment for 4 to 8 hours until it has risen by, I don't know, between 70 and 90%. I'm not a doubling type of bulk fermenter. I feel like particularly for sourdough, and maybe it's just my starter, that if I'm allowing that dough to fully double to 100% grow, then I'm losing a little bit of the strength that it's going to have in terms of the yeast in there, of its ability to ferment when I'm doing my final proofing. And so it takes a little bit longer for it to rise. Whereas if I cut it off at about 70%, that yeast is still a little bit more active, and it's gonna puff up that dough once I've shaped it a little bit quicker. And so that's what I do. So once it's done that, it's hit about 70% of its original size, I portion the dough into 8 113 gram chunks. How did I get to 113 grams? I divided the weight of the total dough ball by 8 because I've heard that between 113 and 120 are normal sizes for a bagel. Last week, the bagels I made, I went with 120 grams. They are oddly bigger actually, compared to 113. I prefer the slightly smaller ones. We're not eating full bagels in my house. Most of us just cut it in half, and the kids and my wife take the top if it has goodies on it. I take the bottom, the sacrifices that I make for my family. So anyways, 113 grams by 8 bagels. I then roll each of those into a nice taut ball. If you make pizza, it's sort of the same way you ball out your pizza dough. And then I let them sit for about a half an hour just because you want that dough to come back together. You don't want those seams to be opening up. So given how stiff this dough is, again, 51% hydration, I'll usually help that seaming by pinching the bottom of the dough after I roll it into a ball, just to make sure that it's nice and closed. And then I put that down on the counter and let it sit for a half an hour to come together. When I'm done doing that, I take my middle finger on my right hand. I'm a right-handed dude. I take my middle finger and my thumb and I poke a hole in the center of that dough ball. I've done a few where my judgment is off and I'm not quite in the center. It doesn't matter. Those are the types of bagels you make that are just a little bit not perfectly round, but they have that nice character to them and the way they look, where you got a smaller side and a bigger side. It all tastes the same in the end. Once you poke that hole, I take my index finger on my left hand or my thumb, depending on how I'm feeling that day. And I use my middle finger on my right hand, both in the bagel hole. And then I just gently kind of roll it around to stretch out that hole. It's going to want to close up a little bit on you when you put it on the parchment paper for the final proofing. So I try to make that hole bigger than I would want it to be in the finished bagel. And that seems to work really well for me. Now, I also don't mind when that hole closes up. As long as you can see that there's a dimple there, I'm cool with that because it makes it easier to put stuff on there without it falling through the hole. So that's just a personal opinion of mine. The vast majority of bagels that I've made so far have a noticeable hole that you can see through, and that's the technique that I use. So you're not actually, I was talking with somebody about bagels the other day at work, and they were saying, so they make sourdough and they want to make bagels. They're saying, so do you like roll out a piece of dough and then connect them in a circle? Oh my God, that would be so difficult. It'd probably fall apart. No, I just poke a hole in the middle of the dough ball, stretch it out, and then I line them up on parchment paper. Now, the parchment paper serves several purposes for this part of it. I know people who will put it directly on like a cookie sheet, and then they're having to kind of peel the dough off the cookie sheet when they go to boil it. The parchment paper for me, this was a trick I found on some YouTube video. You're not getting anything bad out of it if you toss it into boiling water. So it makes it really easy just to pick it up. If you cut the parchment paper around each bagel, you can pick it up, very gently plop it in your boiling water, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. And then it slides right off with that boiling water. It loosens it right up. You're not ripping the dough or anything like that. So, all right. So you've got all of your dough balls poked with holes. They're sitting on your parchment in a nice line. This is something that is, I will say, it's a little bit easier to demonstrate in person than it is to talk about. So hopefully I'm being clear here. They're all lined up on your parchment though. And I cover it with a damp towel. You want to keep just enough room for those bagels to be able to puff up and not touch each other. At least that's what I do. So I separate them by about 2 to 3 inches. And so they're all lined up, which is almost perfect for 8 bagels. If you take a standard, tea towel or, your regular kitchen type towel, make sure it's clean. I get it wet. I wring it out to where it's not dripping at all. It's just barely moist. And then I just put that over the bagels and I will let them rise for anywhere between 2 to 4 hours. Now, one of the things that I did not like about the recipe, that first recipe that I made, is that it recommended, a hard recommendation was 30 to 45 minutes of proofing before you move on to the boil. Don't go past 45 minutes. Those were the densest bagels that I've made to date. I've kind of figured that was going to be the case because when I went to the boil step, they didn't rise much at all. I mean, they looked almost exactly the way they did when I shaped them. So again, if your starter is maybe stronger than mine or working faster, or your house is warmer than the 76 degrees we keep our house, that might impact it. I don't know. I go 2 to 4 hours, even when it's warm outside. What I've found is that the 3.5 to 4 hour mark is what I like the most. I also like my bagels to have a little bit more fluff to them. I don't want them to be dense. So that's what I do. I come back, I notice, and by the way, I've already been asked by people, well, how do you know when they're done proofing? What I do is when they look about what I want my finished bagel to look like, that's when I know that they're done. Because once you boil it, they're going to rise just a touch more. And then after you boil it, you put them in the oven, they're going to rise just a touch more, but not that much more. So if they're starting to look the way that you expect your finished bagel to look, they're probably ready to move on to the next step. And that is the boil. This is the one of the more unique aspects to making bagels, is that you boil them in water. It's a pretty interesting process. I find it very zen. To me, it's a fun part of the process. So when those bagels are risen, they're fully proofed, they're ready to move on to the next step, I prepare the boiling solution by combining about 3 liters of water in a deep saucepan. And then while that's heating up, I weigh out 55 grams of honey and 5 grams of baking soda. I stir that into the hot water as it's coming up to a boil. And why do you add honey and baking soda to the water that you're going to boil your bagels in? There are several reasons for this that I've read. I know bagel makers who prefer one over the other, either honey or baking soda. Here's what I've read, and I might be off on this. Somebody feel free to correct me. The honey is first off going to contribute some level of sweetness that you wouldn't get if you didn't have the honey in the water. But it also creates, and you see this when you pull the bagel out of that boiling water, a sort of tackiness on the dough, the boiled dough, that translates into a very enjoyable, in my opinion, crisp on the cooked bagel. It just a nice little crack when if you don't pay attention to it, you're probably not going to notice much of it. But I really like that. I'm after the whole experience. The baking soda, again, that alkaline water, you add that baking soda, you're adding alkalinity to the water, is what I've read at least contributes that chew and that bite to a bagel. So by blending both, you're kind of getting the best of both worlds. Now, I bring the water, the honey, and the baking soda to a rolling boil. And just like with wort, there are proteins in dough. When you add your bagels to that boiling water, you're going to get some foaming. For me, it's usually after the first 2 minutes or so of boiling a batch of bagels. And I'm sitting there, blowing on the surface of the water to keep that from boiling over. If you don't pay attention and you're using a saucepan the way I do, you could use a deeper, pan if you want to, or a pot of some sort. It's just easier for me to use a saucepan because I'm sitting there paying attention to it. Now, that's just my disclaimer. Keep that in mind if you're going to make these bagels. What I do is I've already cut out each bagel on its own separate piece of parchment paper. Once the water is fully boiling, nice rolling boil, I take one at a time. I do 3 bagels per batch, and I drop them in parchment side down I do 3 in a row. By the time I get that third bagel in, I take my tongs and I grab the parchment from the first bagel that I put in, and I very gently lift it upwards so that the bagel flips over, so that the top of the bagel is now facing down in the water and the bottom is facing up. We're talking, 8 to 10 seconds into the boil. So in my mind, you haven't really done much to the bottom of that bagel yet, but you're now cooking the top of the bagel. I set a timer for 90 seconds. After those 90 seconds are up, I flip the bagels using a spider strainer that I absolutely love. It's one of the most useful tools in the kitchen, in my opinion. That and, some tongs or maybe a chopstick to very gently flip that bagel so that the top is now facing up. Once all 3 are flipped, set a timer for another 90 seconds. Once the timer goes off, I use my spider strainer to very gently pick up each bagel, let it drip off for about, 2 seconds, and I transfer it over to a wire rack that is sitting in a cookie sheet. And it's at that point, once I get all 3 bagels from the first boil batch, I guess, onto the cookie sheet, that's when I'm going to add my toppings, because that tackiness from the honey and the wetness just from the boil itself will allow, sesame seeds or everything bagel seasoning to stick on those bagels really well. And here's the thing. I like to overdo the seasonings on the top, because what I found is a good chunk of them end up falling off when you're slicing the bagels in half and toasting it and moving it around anyways. So the more I put on there, sesame seeds aren't necessarily cheap, but they're also not that expensive. I really like to load up the bagels with that stuff. And then once I sprinkle it on, I like to use my hand to kind of tap it into the bagel so that I know that it's just a little bit more secure. Once that's done, I move on. I repeat that process until all 8 bagels are done being boiled. And then from that point, by the way, when I start the boil process, I also start preheating my oven to 425 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 218 C. So once all of the bagels are sitting on the wire rack, I prepare another cookie sheet by just cookie sheet, and I put more parchment paper on there because it's just easier to throw away a little bit of parchment paper than it is to clean a cookie sheet. I very gently transfer all of the bagels over to the parchment paper on the cookie sheet. I throw those in the oven and I set a timer for 12 and a half minutes. I come back, I flip the bagels, just do a 180 degree turn on the bagels just in case there's some hot spots in the oven. Set the timer for another 12 and a half minutes. And then I'll check on the bagels. And if they have that nice glossy brown, not dark brown, but we tend to like ours, a little less cooked, I suppose, just a nice golden brown color, they're done. I pull them out. I transfer them back to the same wire rack, and I let them cool for at least a half an hour before cutting into them. And that's it. It is it might sound more complicated than it is, but it is just so easy. And you come out with bagels that, like you heard Tim and Craig say, like I've said, like my kids have said, my wife, she still has kind of a penchant for Harry's bagels, but she really does enjoy these ones as well. And I told her I'm going to continue to work on developing a recipe that's a little bit more in line with what she likes from Harry's, but it's so easy. It's so good. It's natural. There's no preservatives. And I think anybody who is already making sourdough will have fun trying out this bagel recipe. So thanks to WG and to Will for asking about bagels and letting me blow hard a bit on what this other passion of mine really is. Again, if you try it out, let me know. I'd love to hear from you. That is all the time we've got for our 430th episode. Man, thank you all so much for listening to the show, and an extra special thanks to our patrons for supporting us as well as for submitting the questions. These episodes really are such fun time for me, our co-hosts, when we have co-hosts. Let me know what you think about me going on these alone. Sometimes we struggle, to get co-hosts to do this. We are all regular employees at other jobs while doing this Brülosophy stuff on the side, so it's not always easy to find time for two people to get together. If there's anything you'd like for us to address in a future Brü A episode, I would consider becoming a patron, as we're almost certainly going to get to any questions our patrons ask. But you can also submit your questions at feedback@brülosophy.com. It's just that if patrons are asking questions, they're going to get the priority. Don't forget to check out the Brülosophy Show at youtube.com/@thebrülosophy Show, and make sure to head to brülosophy.com to keep up with all of the fun beer and brewing stuff we are up to. The Brülosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brülosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brülosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brülosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.